If you want to become an editor or understand the film that you watch regularly, layer by layer, then this book.
It would be in the blink of an eye.
Walter Murch is one of the most respected film editors of all time.
In the blink of an eye.
And his book, In the Blink of an Eye,
Is in the blink of an eye.
I know you are intelligent enough to listen to this audiobook to enrich your intelligence much more. Methods and machines, marble and clay. The tools you choose to edit with can have a determining effect on the final product. But when I started editing in 1965, there was really just one option, at least in Hollywood, the Moviola, a stand-up editing machine, virtually unchanged since the 1930s, that looks something like a sewing machine and sounds like one. In the early days of Zoetrope Studios, which was founded on a European model, we used imported Steenbecks or Chems, horizontal editing machines from Germany that were quieter and handled the film more gently, had 2 large screens and 2 soundtracks, and were better able to handle large amounts of film. Now, of course, the landscape has been permanently altered by the computer. Electronic digital editing machines, such as Avid and Lightworks, that harness together a video display terminal and a computer with a large-scale memory bank where the film's images and sounds can be stored digitally. I feel equally comfortable working on a Moviola, a Chem Universal, or an Avid. It depends on the film's budget and schedule, and on my hunch about the style of the director and how long the average take is going to be. The Conversation was edited on a Chem, Julia on a Moviola, Apocalypse Now on a Chem, whereas I used both on Bearable. It started out on a Moviola and changed to a Chem. With the Chem, I arrange things opposite of the way they are normally done, so that the screen directly in front of me is my search screen, and the soundtrack in front of me is in sync with that. The screen on the left side and the sound on the right side are in sync with each other and hold the assembled film. If I were working on a bench, that would be what's going through the synchronizer. In fact, speaking of benches, I should add that I work standing up. My Chem is raised about 15 inches off floor to put it at the right height for me. One of the things I always liked about the Moviola is that you stand up to work, holding the Moviola in a kind of embrace, dancing with it in a way. So it was frustrating for me to have to sit down at the Chem. I edited both The Conversation and Apocalypse that way, sitting down, but a voice in the back of my head kept telling me something wasn't quite right. And so when I came to edit Unbearable, I had the Chem raised up on 2 plywood boxes. Editing is a kind of surgery, and have you ever seen a surgeon sitting to perform an operation? Editing is also like cooking, and no one sits down at the stove to cook. But most of all, editing is a kind of dance. The finished film is a kind of crystallized dance. And when have you ever seen a dancer sitting down to dance? Other than the standing-sitting question, the differences between the Moviola system and the Chem system boil down to sculptural ones. The Moviola system emulsifies the film into little bits, individual shots, and then the editor reassembles it out of those bits, like making something out of clay. You take a little bit of clay, and you stick it here, and you take another little bit of clay, and you stick it there. At the beginning of the process, there is nothing in front of you, then there is something in front of you, and then there is finally the finished thing, all built up out of little clay bricks, little pellets of information. With the Chem system, I don't ever break the film down into individual shots. I leave it in 10-minute rolls in the order in which it came from the lab. In sculptural terms, this is like a block of marble. The sculpture is already there, hidden within the stone, and you reveal it by taking away rather than building it up piece by piece from nothing as you do with clay. It is really the difference between random access editing and it's whatever that is called, linear access, let's say. Computerized digital editing and, strangely enough, good old-fashioned Moviola editing with an assistant are both random access, non-linear systems. You ask for something specific and that thing alone is delivered to you as quickly as possible. You are only shown what you ask for. The Avid is faster at it than the Moviola, but the process is the same. That's a drawback for me because your choices can then only be as good as your requests, and sometimes that is not enough. There is a higher level that comes through recognition. You may not be able to articulate what you want, but you can recognize it when you see it. What do I mean by that? Well, if you learn to speak a foreign language, you will find that there is a gap between how well you can speak it and how well you can understand it when it is spoken to you. A human being's ability to understand a foreign language is always greater than his ability to speak it. And when you make a film, you are trying to learn a foreign language. It just happens to be a unique language that is only spoken by this one film. If you have to articulate everything, as you do with a random access system like video/computer or Moviola/Assistant, you are limited by what and how much you can articulate and how good your original notes were. Whereas the advantage of the Chems linear system is that I do not always have to be speaking to it. There are times when it speaks to me. The system is constantly presenting things for consideration, and a sort of dialogue takes place. I might say, I want to see that close-up of Teresa, number 317 in roll 45. But I'll put that roll on the machine, and as I spool down to number 317, which may be hundreds of feet from the start, the machine shows me everything at high speed down to that point, saying in effect, how about this instead? Or this? And I find more often than not, long before I get down to shot 317, that I've had 3 other ideas triggered by the material that I have seen flashing by me. Oh, this other shot is much better than the one I thought I wanted. As soon as I saw it, I recognized it as a possibility, whereas I couldn't articulate it as a choice. When you look at dailies the first time, you have a relatively fixed idea based on the script of what you are looking for. Later on, though, you review some of your original notes, and they will say, for instance, 2 and 12, 4, NG. What does that mean? It meant that at the time you thought take 4 of slate 212 was no good, and you didn't bother to make a note of why you thought so. Well, many times in the re-editing, what you thought was originally unusable may come to be your salvation. If it was a question of only 1 shot or 2 dozen shots, you could probably deal with the problem of second-guessing those original notes. But in fact, an ordinary film will have 700, 1,000, 2,000 setups with more than 2 printed takes per setup on average. And so there may easily be 2,000 to 4,000 shots that you have to have an opinion about. That's a lot of second guessing. So you tend to fall back on your first impressions in the original notes, which are valuable but limited if that is all you have. Whereas with the KM system, because the film is all stored in these big rolls in an almost arbitrary way, you are learning something new about the material as you search for what you think you want. You are actually doing creative work, and you may find what you really want rather than what you thought you wanted. This system is useful enough in the original assembly of the scene, in helping you to familiarize yourself with the material, but it becomes particularly valuable in the recutting, where your original notes, heavily influenced by the script, become less and less useful as the film finds its own voice. There are limits, of course. A system that is too linear, which means that you have to spend too much time searching before you find what you want, would be burdensome. You would quickly become overwhelmed and/or bored with it. So there is a golden mean somewhere. If the system is completely random access, that is a defect, in my opinion. But if it is too linear, that's a defect as well. What I've found personally is that given the attitude I have toward the material, given the speed that I work, and given the mechanical speed of the chem itself, keeping the dailies in 10-minute reels in shooting order adds just about the right amount of chaos that I need in order to work the way I want to. The digital systems, Avid and Lightworks, are promising because they offer the potential to merge the best of the Moviola's nonlinear approach with the best of the chem's ability to handle and review large amounts of material quickly. At this point, there is still some procedural awkwardness with the digital systems, but I expect those to be smoothed out over time. In any case, there are certain things that remain the same for me no matter what system I am using. I would always review the material twice. Once at the beginning, the day after the material was shot, noting down my first impressions and including any notes the director cares to give me. And then when I was ready to cut a particular scene, I would collect all the relevant material and review it again, making notes in more detail than the first time. When you look at rushes the second time, you have evolved and the film has evolved. You will see different things than you saw the first time. The fact because you may have assembled scenes that hadn't been shot the first time you saw the material, and strengths or problems may be emerging with characters and events as they unfold. In an ideal world, what I would like to do is assemble a first cut and then stop and just look at all the dailies again, fresh. Whether I would ever actually be able to do that is another question. The present schedule of films, at any rate, prohibits such a thing. This is where the hidden virtues, the linear KM system, come in. Because of the way the material is stored in 10-minute rolls of film, it is constantly being reviewed. If this were gardening, I would be talking about the virtues of turning over the soil and aerating it. In the actual editing of a scene, I will keep on working until I can no longer see myself in the material. When I review my first assembly of a scene, more often than not, I can still vividly, too vividly, recall making the decisions that led to each of the cuts. But as the scene is reworked and refined, it reaches a point, hopefully, where the shots themselves seem to create each other. This shot makes the next shot, which makes the next shot, etc. In this way, the Walter Murch who decided things initially gradually recedes until finally there comes a point where he has become invisible and the characters take over. The shots, the emotion, the story seem to take over. Sometimes, the best times, this process reaches the point where I can look at the scene and say, I didn't have anything to do with that. It just created itself. As far as the color balance of the final prints goes, I've had a few good experiences, but many have been frustrating for one reason or another. The worst thing is that the labs show the film at 24 frames per second and sometimes even at 32 FPS without the ability to stop or go backward. You are sitting there and saying, that shot should be redder. Which one? The close-up of the foot. But already 8 shots have gone by. Most often, the impression you get is that they are doing this as a courtesy just to keep you quiet. One way that works for me, where you can really see what's going on and get specific with your notes about color, is to take the work print and the first answer print and put them in sync over a light box of the correct color temperature. There is something about a low level of light coming through a piece of film that enables you to see tonalities that are almost invisible if you're looking at a bright screen of projected light. There may be a residual greenness, but you look at the film in a viewing theater and you'll say, I don't know, is that shot a little green or is it too blue? And of course, before you have decided, you are looking at something else. If you work with the Lightbox system, the green will just leap out, especially if you've got your original work print there for comparison. And you can stop, go forward, go backward, etc. If you are fortunate enough to be working with a good color timer at a good laboratory, of course, it is like any sort of successful collaboration. Test screenings. Referred pane. Toward the end of the editing process on Julia, Fred Zinnemann observed that he felt the director and the editor, alone with the film for months and months, could only go 90% of the way toward the finished film, that what was needed for the last 10% was the participation of the audience, whom he saw as his final collaborators, not in the sense that he would respond to them blindly, but that he felt their presence was helpful as a corrective to keep certain obsessions from becoming corrosive and to point out blind spots that may have developed through overfamiliarity with the material. This has certainly been my experience. All of the films I have worked on have been tested before large audiences, except for The Conversation and Unbearable Lightness. We had screenings of them, of course, but we never had wide open public screenings. Francis Coppola in particular has always been an enthusiastic supporter of screening his films almost at any stage, almost no matter how unfinished they were. Rough screenings would be for small groups of about 10 people whom he knew, mixed with 2 or 3 people who were strangers. The strangers would have no previous idea of what this film was about, and he would question them afterward on a one-to-one basis to compare their opinions to the reaction of the people who did know about the film. Fred Zinnemann, by contrast, would show Julia to a preview audience only when it was technically completely finished, with a cut negative and optical soundtrack. He was perfectly prepared to change it after that, but he doesn't believe that general audiences can completely discount visible splices, color mismatches, and incomplete soundtracks. And I agree with him. Even with technically finished films, public previews are tricky things. You can learn a tremendous amount from them, but you have to be cautious about direct interpretations of what people have to say to you, particularly on those cards they fill out after the screening. I'm extremely suspicious of those. The most helpful thing of all is simply learning how you feel when the film is being shown to 600 people who have never seen it before. Emotionally, it seems like some big hand has come and grabbed you by the hair, picked you up, and put you down 90 degrees to one side. And you think, oh God, look at that. It's as if up to this moment you have been constructing a building, but always standing in front of it to evaluate it. Now all of a sudden, you are looking at the side of the building and seeing things you seem to have never seen before. You shouldn't blindly follow what you learn from these test screenings any more than you should anything else. What can you learn from the differences between the previous screenings and this one? Given these two headings, where is the North Pole? Test screenings are just a way to find out where you are. There was one procedure on Julia that, unfortunately, I have never seen repeated. We had a person sitting at a table in the lobby of the preview theater with a sign in front of him that said, if you want to talk to us on the telephone after a few days, leave your number here. And then those conversations were transcribed and added into the survey. If you are going to do previews and listen to what people have to say, that's the way to do it, a day or two to let the film sink in. Don't look at what people write in the heat of the moment. You get a reaction, but it is a skewed reaction. There's a lot of what is medically called referred pain in that process. When you go to a doctor and tell him that you have a pain in your elbow, it is the quack who takes out his scalpel and starts to operate on the elbow. Then you wind up with not only the original pain, but probably a pain in your wrist and your shoulder as well. Whereas an experienced doctor studies you, takes an x-ray and determines that the cause of the pain is probably a pinched nerve up in your shoulder. You just happen to feel it in your elbow. The pain in the shoulder has been referred to the elbow. Audience reactions are like that. When you ask the direct question, what was your least favorite scene? And 80% of the people are in agreement about one scene they do not like, the impulse is to fix the scene or cut it out. But the chances are that that scene is fine. Instead, the problem may be that the audience simply didn't understand something that they needed to know for the scene to work. So instead of fixing the scene itself, you might clarify some exposition that happens 5 minutes earlier. Don't necessarily operate on the elbow. Instead, discover if nerves are being pinched somewhere else, but the audience will never tell you that directly. They will simply tell you where the pain is, not the source of the pain. Editing decisions become particularly acute in the last days before the film is released, since changes made now will be permanent. If you, as the editor, have a particularly strong feeling about something at this stage, you should try to make your point as forcefully and convincingly as you can. Perhaps you stay late and do a test version of your idea, sketch something out, but you also need to have discretion, a sense of who you are dealing with, and present your ideas to the director or producer in the right context. And how you go about this has to do with your whole working history, how you were hired, how much you respect the director, how much the director respects you. I remember one moment, particularly after the previews of Julia, when Fred Zinnemann and I were debating what final changes to make in the structure of the beginning, which seemed to have been difficult for the audience to follow. The opening reel of the film had a nested sequence of flashbacks, a memory of a memory of a memory, and it was perhaps one too many. I suggested eliminating of one scene that occupied a unique time frame in the film's structure, one that was never reprised. And we decided to remove this since it meant that the scenes that were left would consequently sort themselves into a more graspable sequence. As I was undoing the splices, and they made a little screech as they came apart, almost as if they were crying out in pain, Zinnemann looked thoughtfully at what was happening and observed in an almost offhand way, You know, when I first read this scene in the script, I knew that I could do this film. I hesitated briefly, looked at him, and then continued undoing the splices. But my heart was in my throat because at that stage in the process, you do not know. You can only have faith that what you are doing is the right thing. Were we mistakenly cutting out the heart of the film, or were we snipping off the umbilical cord? In retrospect, I believe it was the umbilical cord and that we were right to remove it. The scene did have an essential function at one point, which was to connect Fred Zinnemann to the project. But once that connection had been made and Zinnemann's sensibility had flowed through that scene into all the other scenes in the film, it could finally be removed without any harm. But things like that do give you pause.